Welcome to this fifth installment of this webinar series, proudly organized by the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability here at Hiroshima University. My name is Dalia Simangan, Assistant Professor at Hiroshima University and one of the core members of NERPS, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this NERPS webinar series started last year in September with the inaugural talk by Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs. We invite leading experts on topics related to the relationship between peace and sustainability in the context of global change. To start off, I'd like to invite our NERPS director, Professor Shinji Kaneko, for his welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Daria. My name is Kaneko. Good afternoon, the participant from Japan and Asia. And I think good morning from Europe, Stockholm. And then hello to the rest of the world. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome all of you to this fifth NERPS webinar series this time. And the same as last time, today's talk is also given by our four close appointed professors at the Hiroshima University. Dr. Florian Krampe, the senior researcher at SIPLI, the Stockholm Institute, International Peace and Research Institute. So NERPS is focusing on, as you may be clearly aware, that the nexus between peace and sustainability. So it is our great pleasure to have a new partnership with SIPLI this time as one of the world leading institutions on peace research. And also with this institute, the Florian is one of the most active researchers who is leading on this topic on climate cyclicity and peace impact on post-conflict peace building, which is clearly one of the most important elements of this nexus between peace and sustainability. So, and also let me thank Kumamoto-san this time today, the director of UNITAL Office of Hiroshima, who is kindly agreeing to join this webinar as a commentator. This quite busy schedule, I really thank you for your time to join this webinar. So UNITAL office in Hiroshima has, I think, rich experiences and also achievement in training professionals in the field of peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, and disarmament, etc. And as it is a very, very important partner for NERPS and I think also SIPLI. So this is a very relevant, the commentator this time to implement these transdisciplinary researches. So finally, I'd like to mention again that we are planning to have a face-to-face first international conference at Hiroshima at the early next year, hopefully. So inviting all these participants and network members constructed through this webinar series. So I really wish to have very productive discussions and looking forward, exploring new collaborative works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaneko. So for this webinar, we have a speaker and a discussant, as Kaneko-sensei mentioned. I will introduce Kumamoto-san, our discussant, later, right after the talk. But first, let me introduce our speaker. He's a senior researcher and director of SIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program, an affiliated researcher at the Research School for International Water Cooperation at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University. And more recently, our very own specially appointed professor here at NERPS. He does research on the foundations of peace and security, and at present, he focuses on climate security and the post-conflict management of natural resources. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome our speaker, Dr. Florian Krampe.
Thank you, Dalia, and thank you, Professor, for the kind introduction and the opportunity to well, on the one hand, present here, but also to be part of the NERPS family with conducting this research project. I want to start off with a little story. Actually, when I applied for my PhD in Uppsala in 2010, I was a bit tired of this whole debate about climate change causing conflict and all this. And I was like, well, actually, does it really matter, right? Because if you think about it, we have conflicts in areas highly exposed by climate change. So the question is not just what does that have anything to do with each other on this typical link, climate change causing conflict, but actually, what does it have to do with the problem for peace building, right? I was always interested in peace building. I was more like curious, like that can't help, right? Doing peace building in an area highly exposed for climate change, that can't be helpful. So a couple of years ago or 2 years ago at CIPRI, I had the chance then to after doing a PhD in Uppsala and working for a few years, you finally have the time to do what you actually wanted to do in the first place 10 years ago, right? So I was able to look at the data. And what we found was that actually 8 out of 10 peace operations with most multilateral peace operation staff are in areas or in those countries most exposed to climate change. So in a way, it confirms exactly this problem, right? And I think where maybe the time is right now, even though I didn't want to go, or was a bit tired of that road, but I think what we increasingly see also on the research front on the linkages with climate-related security risks is that the human security risks of today are increasingly becoming the hard security challenges of tomorrow, right? And countering any thought on or are we securitizing the climate agenda, but it is evident there are no hard security solutions to fighting a drought. There are no hard security solutions to responding to flooding, right? So I think that is a misled debate. I think what is the real question here becomes actually, or what the real conclusion out of that is that climate change and the impact of climate change are transforming the security landscape. It is not the traditional security landscapes that we had, maybe never had if you look back carefully, right? But in an age of climate change and the Anthropocene, the security landscape is a different one. I'm really happy to give this talk. As you introduced me, yeah, I've actually looked at this now for over 10 years in various forms, looking at the environmental peace building linkages. Started off with looking at peace parks a couple of years ago. And today I'm really proud to lead CIPRI's research on climate security risks and moving this forward. What we typically do, our program is focused essentially on 3 building blocks. The first one is we try to understand the linkages between climate change and conflict, or climate change and security risks. The second part is trying to understand what are organizational responses? What are actually the actors that would be responding to this do? What is the discourse? How are they discussing climate security? But also, what are they actually doing? With an not really hidden intent of that probably in an ideal world, they match, right? If you want to respond to climate-related security risks in a region, they hopefully match with the risks that we see and are visible. But so that is where our program stands. We're around 10 people in this program at the moment, working on various projects. What I'm going to talk about today is peace and sustainability in the Anthropocene, meeting the evolving peace requirements of post-conflict societies. And I'll share some insights on 3 main areas from the research that we've done the last years, which is on the one hand, the impacts of climate change on peace and security in the context of peace building or peace operations, right? The second one is the impacts on governance and state building. And the third one is the impact on development and the humanitarian situation in the countries. If you think about it, all 3 core elements of every peace operation and peace mission typically. And finishing off, I'll outline a bit more what we are going to do moving forward with colleagues at Hiroshima University and this project that we're having. So the impact on peace and security, and I'm building here mainly on our research that we have done the last years, to some extent looking into Afghanistan, but we have followed with a big study on Somalia, on UNSOM, trying to understand not just what is going on in Somalia, but what is actually the impact that this has on the mandate of the UN mission in the field. And what we see is actually surprised. I was confident we'll find something, but I was actually surprised that we found impacts across the mandate of UNSOM, which was really interesting. So in terms of the impact in peace and security, we see that actors that typically will deny anything having anything to do with climate change in the security sector reform blocks, right? We see actual evidence that they have to deal with climate change and that climate change is actually impacting their work. It starts with, on the one hand, an impact on the dynamics of peace and conflict as such, but more interestingly, we see impacts on DDR programming. We see instances where climate change is one of the factors. It's a complicated thing, but where climate change is increasingly one of the factors in Somalia, contributing to conditions that enable recruitment, for example, for Al-Shabaab. Right? It's like, not to oversimplify this link. There are many reasons and many explanations, and there's no linearity in it. But we see increasingly that climate change is exerting pressures which get people to move, especially into urban areas around Mogadishu, which are in itself becoming a breeding ground where recruitment is increasingly happening. What we also see, and I think is interesting, with it, there's some debate around it, but we see that especially in our follow-up study now in Mali as well, the impacts on operational readiness, right? So actually, it impacts the mission's logistics, be it flooding, be it sandstorms, being the pure exposure to the harsh environment. But interestingly, there are also trends where we see that it impacts the mobility of different armed actors and creates actually an asymmetry in itself, right? While for example, in Somalia, AMISOM will not be able to move into certain areas anymore because, well, you're a military actor, you have heavy equipment. Actors like Al-Shabaab will be much more adept to operating with a very light footprint. Motorbikes in Mali, we see insurgent groups using boats and motorbikes to travel during flooding seasons, right? They're much more flexible, creating this interesting asymmetry, and which has again impacts on the security situation that we see. So we see impacts on peace and security, but we also see, interestingly, impacts on the governance and state building elements. Especially we see that the impacts of climate change are undermining the legitimacy of the state building project, which I find really interesting. And there are two explanations for that. On the one hand, well, we're dealing with a very weak state, typically in this instance, right? With a state that is not just busy thinking about the next environmental legislation, but actually dealing with conflict. So there's an obvious lack in the responsiveness to the impact of climate change on the ground. The ability to provide basic services in that regard is something that subsequently undermines the state-society relationship, the social contract, that let's maybe say it doesn't aid rebuilding it. I'm not sure that we have exact evidence for it deteriorating even further, but we clearly don't see that the social contract between the state and society would improve through service provision. But interestingly, climate change increasingly provides opportunities for insurgent groups to become service providers, right? We see that in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab has changed its strategy in recent years. Before, it was looting the World Food Programme convoys. In a later iteration, it started to tax them, and itself provides a service, right? A really interesting strategy change, I think, which then again on the one hand feeds your war chest to some extent, but it also gives you the credibility of a de facto state in this place. Another really interesting point, and I don't think that was really known before we did this study on Somalia, is how climate change increasingly puts existing peace agreements, especially on a more local level, under pressure. We see interesting cases of the case of Baidoa. I'm not saying climate change is the only thing here, but climate change is one of the drivers of migration, of internally displacement to the city of Baidoa, where UNSOM, the UN mission in Somalia, had created a very carefully crafted power sharing agreement between ethnic groups, right, as we do, trying to manifest and set the structures, allocating seats, allocating along ethnic lines. Well, the influx of IDPs into the village changed the complete ethnic composition of the town, right? So your power sharing agreement is essentially obsolete. It doesn't represent anymore the power relationships in the place. Something we haven't really thought about, right? In the thing. So how do we make our peace agreements actually more resilient or climate proof these things? How can we take account for that in peace mediation? How do we deal with the large uncertainty, which is actually what we want to take out with the peace agreement, right? But how do we take care of the large uncertainties that comes with the increasing pressures with climate and environmental change? Moving from the impacts on governance and state building to the challenges for development and the humanitarian situation. We see, on the one hand, in Somalia, an increase in the risk of sexually and gender-based violence for both genders, right? Both for men and women. On the one hand, because the needs to collect water are increasingly pushing people to have to travel longer distances, exposing them to a very insecure environment. On the other hand, interestingly, also, well, pastoralists also have to travel further distances and increasingly get into insecure situations with it. Another trend related to the last point, that pastoralists are traveling more, is actually and linked to a large extent of the migration patterns, for example, in Somalia, is a feminization of villages. And we see that actually across multiple countries where the ones left are the women, which on the one hand is exposing to new security risks. At the other time, it's actually also a factor which provides opportunities for empowerment, right? I think there's an interesting space for future research. I know UN Environment has done interesting work on South Sudan, where you actually see the empowerment element really carefully. So this is the space where we're at, right? This is what the research shows. We see that the security landscape is changing, and actually what is changing with it is the requirements and the demands for building peace in these type of contexts. We see the impacts on peace and security, we see the impact on governance and state building, and we see impacts on development and the humanitarian situation. So what the heck do we do now? The project with Hiroshima University and with NERPS and Dalia is part of that, and some other colleagues, is trying to get a grasp on understanding the changing peace requirements of post-conflict societies. And to do that, what we are doing is trying to understand that a bit more on a complex multi-level, on multiple levels. On the one hand, we want to map out more the data on peace operations with its links to environment, but also actually looking at UN Security Council resolutions. What is the text within those resolutions, trying to get a bit of a better grab on what is in there, what has changed, how has it changed, is it changing over time in the same mission, etc. But that we want to then combine with qualitative insight, drawing on multiple cases that we as a group worked on, be it Somalia, be it Nepal, Philippines, Mali, etc. with the overall aim to on the one hand contribute, of course, to academic research and the advance of knowledge in this field, but I think there is a really important policy element to this. It is to provide policymakers with a better understanding of how to operationally and programmatically integrate ecological considerations in peace building. And that's it. That's what we're trying to do. And Dalia and I have a paper to write soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Florian. Yes, you reminded me that we have to finish that paper for our conference presentation. But thank you for that excellent talk and presenting us the overview of your project and your plans on how to collaborate with Hiroshima University. For our audience, just a reminder, if you have questions, you can type them anytime in the chat box. And to start our open discussion, let me introduce our discussant for this webinar. She has 20 years of professional experience in the development cooperation field and has been with the United Nations for nearly 20 years. She has worked in Vietnam, New York, Indonesia, Samoa, Cook Islands, and Niue, among other places and at different capacities. She holds a master's degree in economic development from Columbia University. Currently, she is the director of the Division for Prosperity at the UN Institute for Training and Research, or UNITAR, here at Hiroshima. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all welcome Ms. Mihoko Kumamoto.
Thank you so much, Dalia, for kind introduction. And hello, everyone. Well, firstly, let me start by thanking Hiroshima University Professor Kaneko Daria for inviting me as commentator discussant, and Dr. Krampe. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was really looking forward to your presentation. Because right now we have been providing UNITA, United Nations Institute for Training and Research. Our organization has been providing various support to post-conflict countries, including Afghanistan, Sudan, Somalia, Mali. You mentioned these countries. And in my previous capacity, when I was working for UNDP, well, prior to UNITA, I was working for UNDP. I was involved in climate change, actually. Climate change adaptation. So I was really looking forward to it. So thank you so much. Now, I have this great pleasure of starting the Q&A session. So thank you so much. I would like to share a few thoughts and then end with a few questions to Dr. Krampe to facilitate Q&A. The first point is stepping back a little bit and talk a little bit about this term Anthropocene. And I don't know how many of the listeners are familiar with this term. I was quite surprised to see this term in the title and pleasantly surprised. So just for those of you who may not be familiar with this term, it basically means the age of humans. The planet, our Mother Earth, has been in existence for many, many years. And over these years, right now, this is really truly the first time that human beings are driving the ecosystem, this entire world, planet, and we are doing that by choosing our own behaviors, our choices. But that also means that we're going to have to pay attention to what we do to be able to coexist in a balanced manner between human being and the planet. So we are extremely responsible for that. So thank you so much for using this term in the title. I was really, really grateful and happy. And then moving to the next point, once again, I'm very, very excited and happy to know about this research, which I understand has been going on for many years, 10 years. And I would like to share with the audience that integration of climate risks and also environmental risks is happening, but not enough at all, as Dr. Krampe mentioned. And we need to take into consideration climate risks and environmental risks much, much more. Like for example, in terms of analysis level, some of the audience listeners may know this already, but if you look at UNDP's signature report, which is called the UNDP's Human Development Report, what they did for 2020, for the very first time, they have decided to take into consideration so-called planet pressure to develop Human Development Index. So in the past, they looked at socio-economic aspects and also equity aspect and did country ranking in terms of development. But this time in 2020, for the very first time, they took into consideration emissions of carbon dioxide and also material footprint and did country ranking. So in terms of analysis, this has happened. And for people working in this development field, this is a big milestone. And also looking at private, what private sector is doing, it's going on for some time already. This ESG concept. Private companies, some of them, not all of them yet, but some companies are taking into consideration so-called ESG, environment, social, and governance aspect, and try to become good company for society, for the environment. But still, so much more needs to be done. Having said that, overall, we still have to do so much more as individuals, as organizations, as private company. Consumer responsibility, for example, and also government, they have to take into consideration laws, regulations, and incentives, how to use these measures effectively to protect the environment and also help improve people's livelihood. So that's the second point. And the third point is now zooming into this nexus of climate change and peace building, which was the focus of Dr. Krampe's presentation. And once again, thank you so much. And UNITA absolutely agree with the key message, which is urgent needs to take into consideration climate risks into support in fragile states, including conflict and post-conflict countries. And we have, UNITA has been working for various countries, fragile states, and we see it, we see those risks, and we see firsthand that when risks happen, like for example, extreme weathers as a consequence of climate change, when that happens, vulnerable populations, people are the ones who are hit the hardest. People like women, youth, senior people, or people with disabilities, refugees, migrants, and internally displaced people, they are the ones hit the hardest. And it's, we can imagine very easily. I live in Hiroshima, and as many of you know, and I believe some of you live in Hiroshima, recently we are experiencing more extreme weathers, higher, stronger magnitude, and higher frequency. And when you think about the damage and try to look at who has been affected the most, those are the people who have been marginalized in Hiroshima. So you can easily imagine in conflict countries where resources are limited, such as informational, technological, and financial resources, they are significantly affected. And even in those countries, vulnerable populations are the hardest hit. It is critical to incorporate those risks. Now, from this point on, I would like to move to my questions to Dr. Krampe. Thank you so much for your presentation. Three key questions. Number one is, you said that you have been looking at 10 countries or 8. Have you seen any successful cases where peacekeeping operations or political missions have been successfully been able to integrate climate risks and produce good results? So that's number one. And number two, when you compare these different countries, have you noticed any significant differences? So that's my second question. And my third question, this is a very practical question, and this is something that practitioners like myself often see. On the ground, what I often hear and see is so-called mainstream fatigue. For people operating in the field, there are so many risks they need to take into consideration, or new aspects, and environmental risks and climate risks, and also making sure that gender lens is incorporated. Not all the time, but sometimes practitioners get so overwhelmed. Oh, here is another aspect that we have to take into consideration, so-called mainstream fatigue. So if you have any recommendation to help mitigate mainstream fatigue on the ground, that would be really interesting to hear. So thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kumamoto, for those important insights and food for thought for us. I will now ask Florian to respond while we collect questions from our audience.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Very thoughtful comments, and I fully agree, and excellent questions. I actually wrote down, like, things the Human Development Report taking on the Anthropocene as a new backbone is really important, and again signifies that the landscape changes, right? The old doesn't work anymore. There are new things we need to take into account, and we need to consider. And I'm sure Dalia has a lot to say about the Anthropocene discourse as such. Also, so she does excellent work on that. In regard to your questions, really excellent. I think in terms of success in missions, so on the one hand, what I realized is missions will tell you that we don't do climate security, partially because of what you allude to in part 3, right? We're really busy, prevention of protection of civilians is really busy. It's a really important thing. Like, now you want me to think about something else? Well, at the same time, what we see is those doing POC work are actually recognized. Well, there's a seasonal trend in the violence. It relates to agricultural seasons. Agricultural seasons are shifting, which are disrupting social or traditional trends a bit. So I think there is an important fact. There is an element they know something is going on, and I think what's lacking is the tools. But then there are really positive examples, and we might say a lot of bad things or not see a lot of hope in Somalia a lot of times, right? With 3 decades of conflict and civil war going on. But I think there are really promising signs and really important steps. One is derived out of failure. Don't remember which date it was. I think it was a 2011 drought in Somalia. The UN failed. The UN couldn't respond, right? And part of the problem was like that, well, donor A gives money to World Food Program. World Food Program goes to village A, B, and C. Another donor gives money to UNICEF. They go there, and and we have 20 donors. Everybody goes somewhere. Nobody's talking to each other. Really, I'm exaggerating a bit here, but in principle, right? We're all over the place. We're not talking to each other. It didn't work. The good thing is people learned in the mission. So in 2017, when a drought was approaching and the famine there was a famine risk, what they started were drought operation coordination centers. something like that. Yeah, proud. Yeah, anyway, the key point is here, not that these are the perfect thing for the future, but what happened is the UN mission, the deputy special representative, resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator took the responsibility and said, like, give me the money and I'm coordinating, right? Actually taking on this role. Creating these centers where on the one hand, the Somali government is sitting, where the UN actors are sitting, where NGOs are sitting, where other international organizations are sitting, and deciding and coordinating a response. There wasn't a famine, right? Something worked. A really good example of what we need to do, reiterating like deliver is one, is a thing, right? That we should really work hard to achieve. The same thing that was done really well here in Somalia is they did a drought impact and needs assessment, but they followed it up with a resilience framework for the government, right? So there's not this gap between, well, we need to understand what we need to fix today, and then we leave it and you know, and somebody else figures out what to do tomorrow. There was a plan. Again, this is not perfect, but at least it shows, it bridges our short-term, long-term problem to some extent. Those are two examples. I think there are more. We have the environmental security advisor placed within the mission now. So we have a dedicated person in Somalia who is taking on this task. It's an insurmountable task. If you think about it, for one person, he needs much more money. He needs much more flexible money, right? Again, things are very earmarked for specific things. That doesn't work in this context anymore. We need to be able to have this flexibility and direct. On the significance of or significant differences between countries, I think Mali and Somalia, this is the studies so Somalia we did, and MINUSMA Mali we're just finishing off. It's not the same thing. It is really not the same thing. And I think that is, on the one hand, a really disconcerting thing, because you know, you can't just take your response A out of the drawer and apply it. You need to understand what's going on. You need to understand the context. Very similar dynamics that lead to increased risk of violence in Somalia have absolutely different outcomes in Mali. Things that have to do with climate change in Somalia have absolutely nothing to do with climate change in Mali, right? A really different context, really complicated to understand, and needs a lot more analysis, which is important then for the training and understanding in the missions to actually try to make sense of that, right? Because as you said, you're really busy, you're doing a lot of things. On the mainstreaming fatigue, and I think a different word in the peace operations field that I hear is sort of Christmas tree mandates, right? You have to do everything. Like, well, let me put climate change also on the tree. I think there's a fair point of that, but what we need to understand, and to repeat the point, right? Things are different. The field is changing. Responding to climate change and climate-related security risks is not another ball on the tree. It is actually something for every ball on that tree, right? And we need to understand that. That means we need to understand that working through, let's say, improving an irrigation process, making it more climate resilient, is on the one hand climate adaptation. It is development, and it can be peace building. Once we understand that, once we understand these synergies between those, it isn't another ball on the Christmas tree. It is actually a very synergetic point. It actually saves money. It takes actually a few balls off the Christmas tree and merges them into bigger balls. I'm overstretching this metaphor a little bit now, but yeah, no, but thank you so much. They're very excellent questions. I hope I answered them.
Thank you, Florian. Maybe I can overstretch that metaphor one more time, that Christmas tree, because I think that's where this concept of the Anthropocene comes in, the relevance of it, because it gives a sense of urgency on peace building activities and somehow tells us that peace building activities are now concerns on a planetary scale, right? So the Anthropocene maybe is the Christmas tree, and you have all these other balls in the Christmas tree. So the concept ties all these activities together. So I think that's where the relevance of the concept comes in as well. So I will raise two questions from our attendees. One is from Prakash Paudel, a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. And his question is for Florian: how important it is to address the climate-related conflict risks by the development donors in the countries coming out of civil wars. Is there any framework to assess these interventions? And another question is from here at Hiroshima University, Professor Keiso Tatsukawa, and I think Ms. Kumamoto or Florian can answer this question. How do you evaluate the relevance and timeliness of peace building in the context of the Paris Agreement? There are a couple more questions, but I will let you respond to those first.
Okay, let's start with the first one. I think I alluded to that with a response to Mihoko before, right? I think that it's really important for development donors to take this on. But there needs to be coordination. There needs to be support. What I'm getting really tired of is we're doing the same thing so many times, but we never do them properly, right? I think the way some colleagues in some discussions in Africa put it, like, well, sending a lot of pilot projects, right? Like, how about you send the plane? Right, we're trying a lot of things, but we never follow through with a big thing. And Germany does something in Village A, and Japan supports some programs in Village B, and they run out, and we stop. There needs to be much more a coherent, systemic approach to this, and this is really important because the risks are different. What really annoys me then is that you have regional approaches, for example, in the Horn of Africa through the early warning mechanism C1, right, where you have an operational system of managing or getting early warning on how herding routes are changing, right? Where are herders today? What route are they taking? When are they crossing the border? When are they coming through village X, right? A really simple system. Money ran out. Donor didn't fund it anymore. Can't do the project anymore. You're like, I mean, what is that? Right? We need to follow through with these things, and we need to have long-term funding. Peace operations are having funding or a mandate for 1 year, right? So while you're renewing the mandate today for the next 360 days or the next year, you're actually having to budget for the next 2. Right? There's a mismatch with that, and I think the donor role is really important there. I don't think there is a suitable framework currently to address that, to really address these interventions. And as I said, the contexts are so different, so I'm not sure that that's actually a good thing, because it is really difficult and different. Do you want to take the question on the Paris Agreement? I'm still thinking about it. Mihoko?
I think it's a very broad question, and it's there are many ways to answer this question. I will try. I will try my best. You know, it's a peace building itself is a very complex operation, and you know, as Florian mentioned before, they often face many issues and many challenges, and you know, sometimes failures as well. Peace building operations itself and peacekeeping, peace building, it's a very complex undertaking. That's number one. And now we're going to have to think about climate risks. So long answer short, I believe that you know, we are still struggling. We are still trying to find the best way, you know, an effective way to cope with both climate change and also various conflict-related risks and challenges. So how do I evaluate the relevance and timeliness in the context of the Paris Agreement? All I can say is they are, I believe they are just starting to cope with this, as Florian mentioned, still trying to get, the head around it. So I'm expecting lots of, trials and errors now and in the future. Over to Florian.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry for putting the question to you, because I struggled the same way. I think it's a really good question, but it's a really hard one to answer. I think, so, and I'm not going to answer it, but I'm going to say something related. I think what we see is that the incoming NDCs, which are linked to the Paris Agreement, are actually increasingly taking up climate security. Right? We had a study from UNDP, actually colleagues in Linköping University a couple of years ago that looked at the NDCs in that way, but also UNDP and UNFCCC looked at that last year, published a study looking at the first round of NDCs. And now a colleague at CIPRI looked at the next iteration of NDCs. I mean, there are many still coming in before COP next year, later this year. But we see increasingly that climate security is an issue that finds its way into NDCs, right? Which is interesting, because this isn't really a security document, right? Which again just reiterates the point, like things are different, right? UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, there is a climate security element to the whole debate that we need to acknowledge and find ways to integrate.
We have, I think I'm going to throw 3 questions just so we can cover as many questions as we can. We have a question from Juan Diego Padilla. I will just try to paraphrase this one. And he mentioned about the UN conference, I think, on trade and development, report 2020. And there's a package recommendation to invest in the SDGs and a big push to recover. And the development concept and human index development in the framework of SDG has changed because of COVID-19. So do post-conflict countries react differently as well? So if that's how I understand this question. And then the other question is from Arno Bowman. And his question is, how would the panelists describe the idea of further securitizing the climate crisis? Do you think climate security needs to be a bigger issue for policymakers? And then the third one is from Christy Nicholson, and her question is, if you could talk a little bit about whether the extent to which work on environmental peace building or peace operations not only considers climate impacts and risks, but also further environmental degradation or perhaps climate mitigation. Is this something you see as being relevant or being addressed in this field of peace and peace operations?
Yeah, I mean, I think COVID changes a lot, right? And it changes things for post-conflict countries, and it changes things for peace operations, not least in the sense that it reiterates a point that you need to be flexible, right? I mean, you renew your mandate last year. I'm pretty confident that didn't have an item on COVID in there, but that's pretty much one of the biggest challenges you faced last year in the peace operation. So how do you do that if all your frameworks are actually not able to do that, because we're systemically so stuck in a to some extent rightly bureaucratic system, but also annoyingly unbureaucratic to some extent, right? Because it just hinders you. It encourages you to look at your mandate, tick a box, and move on, and don't care what you actually did, right? Instead of looking what is actually the needs out there and what do I need to do and how can I best address it, and find new solutions to that. So I think COVID is changing things. We see peace operations. I think actually there's an interesting element where COVID forced country teams, different UN agencies in different countries together to rethink what they're doing. So it can have a positive effect. We'll see if the promises of green investment and building back better will follow through, but there's a chance here. The second question, do you think climate security needs to be a bigger issue for policymakers? So the privilege we have with working at CIPRI is that it allows us a very close interaction with policymakers on various levels, right? I really appreciate that, and it's a really unique space to be in. So I was chairing a session yesterday with the UN Climate Security Mechanism, and 2 weeks ago with the Peacebuilding Commission member states. We have come far, right? I mean, there was a debate in the UN in 2007. There was one in 2011. And then Sweden brought the issue up in 2017-18 during its tenure, and it hasn't gone out since then, right? And the problem, sort of the metaphor we came up yesterday with, was like, once we started to discuss what actually happened in the meantime, it's like, you know, we are running because this discourse is really important. It is really, really vibrant, and we need to really move forward, which forces us, we don't look back. We have covered so much ground. When in 2017 you would talk to a UN Security Council member, and you would be like, hey, climate security, they're like, what the heck is that? All right, now there will be 2 countries on the council that still understand what climate security is, but they just don't like it, right? Otherwise, we're in a spot where the knowledge space is so advanced that a policymaker in New York, who's busy with a lot of things, knows the climate security discourse, knows the operational challenges, is discussing it on a regular basis from the permanent representative level to the expert level on the bottom, right? The same is true within missions. We have in Somalia, I think is a really special case where we have, on the one hand, in the mission, we have the environmental security advisor on an expert level, but then we have the SRSG who's reporting on it, is pushing the agenda, reporting to it in the council. These are things we didn't have a couple of years ago. Do we need to go further? Yes. But I think the important thing is we need to really acknowledge also, like, we have come really far. We have done really a lot, and we have increased the knowledge space among policymakers. And I think that is really, really interesting. Christy's question, I mean, yes, of course. I mean, environmental degradation, and it becomes really difficult to disaggregate, to be really clear, right? I mean, it becomes, at the end, it becomes very philosophical discussions around, is it climate change, is it climate variability, is it mismanagement of resources, right? And with perfect data, we can probably tease that out. At the end of the day, we will not have this perfect data in a lot of the post-conflict cases we're dealing with, and the answer will never be one. It will always be a combination of a lot. So I think looking at environmental degradation and different processes is really important. Environmental peace building is a really helpful concept to help us rethink that space, not only in terms of risk, but actually looking at the opportunities that can be out there, right? So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Florian. We receive a lot of excellent questions, but I think we only have time for one more. And this is from Johan of the University of Lisbon. And he asked, when talking about climate change and the Anthropocene, there's always the discussion of resilience. How is this resilience incorporated in your project's framework? I think project's framework on the ground. Is it your research project? So perhaps your research project or peace building missions on the ground?
I think it's probably relating to peace missions on the ground, right? I would assume. I think resilience and discussion, I mean, I see Cedric in the room who's paying attention more carefully what I'm saying. I think resilience is an interesting concept. And I would assume on your question, is it implemented in project frameworks on the ground? It will depend who's the donor. If it's the UK, I'm pretty confident it's in the framework, because that's sort of their key an important part of their agenda. But I think the question is what does resilience mean, right? We're throwing it around partially because we don't want to say something, we don't know how to frame it exactly, right? So it can mean a lot of things, and we a lot of questions around that. Are we just shifting off responsibility to somebody else because we don't want to take it? Really important question in the climate change discourse, I think, when we talk about resilience, right? Is it your responsibility somewhere in a village in Somalia, Bangladesh, Mali, Philippines to take care of the impacts of climate change and become more climate resilient, or is that actually something that needs to be solved in on a different level? But I think that gets us in a different, broader discussion, which is nonetheless interesting and important. But yeah, I'm not really sure. Dalia, it's on the Anthropocene. What's your thought?
Maybe that will be for a different webinar. So, all right, okay, unfortunately we don't have enough time for more questions, but in fact we have question from Armin Asrian and Chia Mitsui. For those who were not able to ask their questions, we're going to forward them to Florian and Kumamoto-san for them to respond to you later. Kumamoto-san, do you have any final remarks before we conclude?
No, I don't have any additional points. Just to say that, the questions asked that I see in the chat box, many of these questions are very interesting and important. So thank you so much for that. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me to this session. It was very, very insightful and interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumamoto-san. Thank you again, Florian, for this fantastic discussion. And it's clear from your discussion that we have encouraged new insights, a lot of insights from our audience, making us rethink of what we know about peace building in post-conflict societies and peace building in the Anthropocene. Thank you again for your time and contribution. To our attendees, on behalf of my colleagues at NERPS Hiroshima University, thank you so much for joining us in this webinar. And we're very glad that several regions and countries actually somehow represented today through your participation. And we'll continue this series until our international conference or convention next year, as Kaneko-sensei mentioned. The next webinar will be on February 26th, and we're going to have Professor Ali Cheshmezangi of University of Nottingham, Ningbo, and he will be talking about urban resilience during this COVID-19 pandemic.